The greatest threat to your fantasy novel isn't always a weak plot or a flat character. For many aspiring authors, it's the very act you have been taught to revere: world building. After working with dozens of writers on their manuscripts, I have seen the same pattern derail countless brilliant ideas. So, this is not a video about world building tips. This is a deep structure analysis for writers ready to do the difficult work of putting their story first. And to start, let me show you the two opposing roles at the center of the entire problem. In the craft of fantasy, especially when it comes to building your world, every writer consciously or unconsciously chooses their primary identity. You're either an archivist or an architect. The archivist's function is to catalog the history of a fictional world. This type of writer serves as a meticulous curator, collecting facts, charting genealogies, and chronicling the rise and fall of empires across millennia. Their instinct is to pursue completeness, to build a database so vast and internally consistent that it feels real. An archivist's work at its core is a monument to the lore of the world. But then there's the architect. This writer's function is to design a specific stage for human drama. The architect is an engineer of conflict, carefully constructing a world that exists for one reason: to test a character to their breaking point. Every element they create, from a law of magic to a political border, is a tool intended to generate tension and force difficult choices. An instinct for purpose guides their every move, making the work of the architect a machine for creating meaning. So the archivist gathers what was. The architect gathers what must be for the story to live. And herein lies the central tragedy of our genre. Because a powerful narrative has taken hold that you must be a perfect archivist before you have permission to be an architect. This idea insists that a story is merely an artifact one excavates from a pre-existing, fully realized history. But this inversion of priorities is the silent killer of brilliant fantasy novels, because too many aspiring writers fail at becoming an archivist. And this creates a cultural debt that can never be repaid. Now, a common response I see to this problem is to dismiss it as a personal flaw. Critics and even other writers will label the phenomena as simple procrastination. They will tell you that you are just afraid to start or are hiding in your notes to avoid the difficult work of telling a story. Such a diagnosis is not only unhelpful though, it is fundamentally incorrect. The paralysis so many writers feel is not born from a lack of discipline. This state is the predictable result of executing a flawed architectural blueprint with tremendous painstaking precision. Laziness is not the culprit here. The problem for so many writers is that their dedication is simply being channeled into a system designed for archival, not narrative. So the failure is not in your effort, which is often immense. It is in the very system you were taught to revere. And to fix this, we must first understand the origin of this flawed philosophy. To understand this broken model, we must trace its architecture back to a single monumental source. We have to look at the legacy of J.R.R. Tolkien, and more specifically, the posthumous publication of his life's work, the Silmarillion. Now, it is impossible to overstate Tolkien's importance to the modern fantasy genre. His influence is so foundational that it has become the very groundwater from which nearly all subsequent works have drawn nourishment. The Lord of the Rings is not merely a story, it's a paradigm, an archetypical structure that has defined the expectations of generations of readers and writers. For many, it represents the absolute zenith of what fantasy can achieve in terms of scope, depth, and internal consistency. Middle-earth feels less like an invention and more like a lost chapter of our own ancient history. But this feeling of profound depth, however, is where the trouble begins. After Tolkien's death, his son Christopher undertook the Herculean task of compiling and editing his father's vast collection of unpublished material into a single volume. That volume became the Silmarillion. Many aspiring writers pick up this book assuming it is a novel, perhaps a prequel to the more famous works. But they are confronted with something entirely different here. The Silmarillion is not a story in the conventional sense. There is no single protagonist, no central plot driving the action from one chapter to the next. It is instead a work of profound academic and creative obsession. You can read about the creation of the universe, the forging of celestial lights, the pantheon of gods, and the epic wars between primordial powers. The prose found in the Silmarillion is often biblical in tone, resembling a sacred text more than a piece of narrative fiction. The entire work is a staggering achievement of the human imagination, a testament to a lifetime spent in the patient, meticulous construction of a secondary world. And this is exactly where we have to draw a careful line. As an academic artifact, as a work of world building in its purest form, the Silmarillion is an unparalleled masterpiece. Its publication, however, created a powerful and deeply misleading precedent for those who came after. The very existence of this book planted a dangerous idea in the mind of the genre. It suggested that in order to write a story like The Lord of the Rings, one must first have a complete 10,000-year history in place. This precedent implies that a true story is not something designed from the ground up. It is something you unearth from a history you have already fully chronicled. From this illusion, an immense pressure was born. The unspoken assumption became that if your world was not documented with the same obsessive detail as Middle-earth, it was somehow less valid, less worthy. This right there is the heart of the trap. It reframes the act of writing from one of dramatic construction to one of historical transcription. So the core of the problem here is not Tolkien himself. He was pursuing his own unique passion, and he did it incredibly well. The problem is the widespread misinterpretation of his process. It's a flawed philosophy I call the encyclopedia model. This model is an architectural philosophy that dictates the world is primary and the story is secondary. You see, the encyclopedia model is seductive as well because it feels like productive work. It provides a sense of accomplishment without ever forcing the writer to confront the terrifying vulnerability of a blank page in chapter 1. Filling out a timeline of the Second Age of the Dragon Kings feels concrete and achievable. Figuring out your protagonist's deepest fear and how to manifest it in a compelling scene? That feels abstract and difficult. So the encyclopedia model offers a safe harbor of facts and figures, a place to hide from the messy, unpredictable, and emotionally demanding work of actually crafting human drama. But what it also does, it mistakes the accumulation of data for the creation of meaning. Just imagine an automotive engineer who decides that before they can design a car, they must first invent an entire periodic table of elements from which to build it. That engineer would spend a lifetime developing the theoretical physics of fictional metals, plastic, and rubbers. They might even create a system of chemistry of unparalleled elegance and consistency. Yet for all the brilliant work, they would never actually build a vehicle capable of taking a passenger from one place to another. And that was their original goal. This is the precise dilemma of the writer trapped by the encyclopedia model. They are engaged in a noble, intellectually stimulating, and often beautiful act of creation, but it is an act of creation that is fundamentally divorced from the primary function of a story, which is to create movement, to transport a character and a reader on a transformative journey. So your dedication to your world is not the problem. That passion is the engine of our entire genre. The system into which you are pouring that passion, however, that has to be chosen carefully, or your story will remain imprisoned by the very world that was meant to set it free. Now, to truly understand the structural damage the encyclopedia model inflicts upon a story, we must move from theory to application. And for that purpose, I want to show you a couple of projects that have buckled under the weight of their own magnificent worlds. With that said though, the following are not critiques of the authors themselves, whose imaginations have captivated millions. Instead, this is a clinical analysis of specific structural choices and their unavoidable narrative consequences. By studying these immensely popular and ambitious works, we can isolate the precise points where the impulse of the archivist overwhelms the function of the architect. These are basically cautionary tales written on a grand scale, and the lessons they offer are invaluable for any writer who wishes to build a world that serves rather than suffocates their own story. And the first example I want to cover here is a series that, for many young writers, was a formative entry into epic fantasy: Christopher Paolini's The Inheritance Cycle. The story begins with a classic premise where a young farm boy, Aragon, discovers a dragon egg, bonding with the creature and finding himself thrust into a monolithic struggle against a tyrannical empire. This is a familiar archetypical structure, one that promises adventure, magic, and the transformation of a boy into a hero. The series' world-building is executed with a level of meticulous detail that is truly staggering. Paolini developed multiple functional constructed language for his elves, dwarves, and other races, complete with grammatical rules and expensive vocabularies. Magic operates on a system of intricate, almost scientific laws, which I explain to the reader with painstaking clarity. The cultures of the various peoples are documented with an encyclopedic breadth, covering their poetry, their social customs, and their political histories. On the surface, this appears to be the gold standard of the genre, a world built with the rigor and completeness that the encyclopedia model demands. The architectural flaw, however, is not in the quality of the lore itself. It is in the method of its delivery, and the narrative function it is forced to perform. In the inheritance cycle, the world-building is often presented to the reader as a prerequisite for understanding the story, rather than as an organic outgrowth of the character's immediate struggles. The narrative frequently pauses, sometimes for pages at a time, so that a mentor character can deliver a lecture on linguistics, magical theory, or ancient history. Propulsive tension, the force that pulls a reader from one scene to the next, is generated by unresolved questions and immediate stakes. When the story holds it forward in momentum to explain the precise grammatical reason why an elf speaks a certain way, that tension dissipates. Just imagine a thriller where in the middle of a car chase, one character turns to the other and delivers a detailed monologue on the history of the internal combustion engine. No matter how fascinating that information might be in another context, in that moment, it serves only to destroy the scene's suspense. This is the mechanical problem at the heart of the inheritance cycle's architecture. The world-building elements, brilliant as they may be in isolation, are often deployed as static information dumps rather than as active tools of conflict. It demonstrates a core principle of narrative design. The reader's encyclopedic knowledge of your world is worth nothing if they are not first emotionally invested in the character's journey through it. But with that said, moving on to our second case study, we come to a work of breathtaking prose and profound literary ambition, one that serves as perhaps one of the most poignant cautionary tales in modern fantasy, Patrick Rothfuss's The Kingkiller Chronicle. The series is presented as an autobiography, with the legendary protagonist Quoth recounting his life story to a scribe over the course of 3 days. We are promised the true story behind the myth, a journey from his time as a traveling performer to his entrance into a famed university of magic and beyond. The world of the Kingkiller Chronicle is a masterpiece of revealed depth. It is built on layers of deep, tantalizing mysteries that feel ancient and resonant. There are the Chandrian, for example, a shadowy group of seemingly immortal beings who murder anyone who speaks their true names. You also hear whispers of the Emir, a secret, perhaps holy order working to counter them. The magic system then is tiered, with the common sympathy being a mere shadow of the true magic of naming, the ability to command the fundamental essence of a thing like the wind or fire. These concepts are not explained in encyclopedias. They are woven into campfire stories, fragmented historical text, and cryptic warnings. This is world building as an act of seduction, pulling the reader deeper with the promise of secrets waiting to be uncovered. The sheer magnetism of this approach is undeniable. The problem in this case, however, is one of architectural balance that eventually shatters the immersion. The world's mysteries have become so compelling, so vast and intricate, that they have begun to overshadow the protagonist's tangible present-day goals. The structural implication is that the story is no longer primarily about Quoth achieving a specific objective. It has become a delivery system for the lore of its own world. The original central narrative spine, Quoth's quest to find the Chandrian and avenge his parents, is constantly deferred in favor of subplots and diversions that, while beautifully written, serve primarily to introduce yet another compelling mystery. A story's momentum is driven by a character's active pursuit of a clear goal against mounting opposition. When the world's lore becomes a collection of fascinating but static puzzles, the story risks transforming from a propulsive drama into an intricate museum of curiosities. The consequence of that is that the reader's engagement shifts from asking, "What will the hero do next?" to "What does this clue mean?" This is once more the archivist's triumph over the architect. In Rothfuss's series, the collection and curation of secrets has become more important than the engineering of a focused dramatic journey. And the immense pressure to provide answers that live up to the brilliance of the questions has famously left the trilogy unfinished for over a decade. So Rothfuss's Kingkiller Chronicle stands as a powerful testament to the fact that a world can be too interesting for its own good, creating a set of expectations so immense that the story's own architecture cannot possibly bear the load. In the end, a world built on mystery must still be anchored to a clear causal chain of character choices, or it risks collapsing into a beautiful but ultimately static ruin. Which brings us to the final and perhaps most epic scale example, a series that redefined the scope of modern fantasy, George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire. The story begins with a deceptively focused conflict between a few noble houses in the fictional continent of Westeros, all vying for control of the Iron Throne. However, it quickly expands to encompass a vast and intricate world of political maneuvering, ancient prophecies, and existential threats from beyond the northern border. Martin's approach to world building is rooted in a deep sense of historical realism. This made the initial appeal of the series one of watching these intricate systems collide, with character choices creating ripples that spread across the entire continent. The central architectural choice that defines this series is the exponential expansion of its scope, primarily through the addition of new point-of-view characters. As the story progressed from one book to the next, that narrative lens fractured. We were introduced to new cultures, new contenders for power, and new subplots in distant lands. The world itself, with its sprawling history and its complex networks of cause and effect, effectively became the main character. The story was no longer just about the Starks or the Lannisters. It was about the state of Westeros itself. And the structural implication of this choice is profound, because it led to a gradual dissolution of a central narrative through-line. In a conventional story, the world exists to challenge a protagonist. But here, the multitude of protagonists increasingly exist to illustrate the world. The intricate web of history and politics grew so complex that it began to dictate the plot, demanding new characters and new subplots to serve its own internal logic. Ultimately, the archivist's desire to chronicle the entire world in all its detail completely subsumed the architect's need to construct a focused, convergent plot. The narrative consequence of all this is a crisis of bringing this all together. A story that expands infinitely outward must, for a satisfying conclusion, eventually curve back inward. All the disparate plot threads must ultimately connect and resolve in a way that feels both earned and coherent. But with dozens of viewpoint characters scattered across multiple continents, each with their own goals and conflicts, the sheer mechanical challenge of achieving this convergence becomes almost insurmountable. So instead, the plot fractured into a collection of loosely related novellars, each compelling on its own terms, but lacking a unifying momentum. This is the ultimate representation of the encyclopedia model. The world becomes so vast, so detailed, and so self-sufficient that it no longer requires a story to feel complete. It simply is. And like the Kingkiller Chronicle, this series has faced a now legendary delay, a direct result of the immense architecture challenge created by its own world-building philosophy. So George R. R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire serves as another stark warning that a world, no matter how realistic or complex, must ultimately remain a stage for drama, not the drama itself. Now, these examples, from the burden of exposition to the paralysis of mystery to the crisis of convergence, are all different symptoms of the same underlying condition. They are the inevitable result of prioritizing the world over the story. A writer who finds themselves trapped by the weight of their own lore, seeing their forward momentum grind to a halt, often intuits that something is wrong with the structure. Their response, however, is frequently to treat the symptom, not the root cause. They reach for a set of superficial fixes, believing they can patch the cracks in a fundamentally flawed foundation. And one of the most common of these is the creation of a Watson character. This is a companion or sidekick whose primary narrative function is to be ignorant, allowing them to ask the protagonist questions that prompt a lengthy exposition dump. While the information is delivered through dialogue, the mechanical function remains identical to a textbook. It holds the story to deliver lore. Another frequent attempt then is to apply the writing advice, show don't tell, in a superficial way. This often results in dense, contextless prose, where characters will reference ancient battles or obscure religious schisms without any grounding for the reader. What is intended to create a sense of immersion instead creates confusion, forcing the reader to feel like they have walked into a conversation halfway through. And finally, in a last act of surrender, many writers relegate crucial world-building information to a glossary or an appendix at the back of the book. This is a tacit admission that the story itself was incapable of bearing the world's weight. It is the ultimate separation of world and narrative, framing the lore not as an integral part of the drama, but as a supplemental academic reading. Now, the way I see it, these are not solutions. They are the desperate measures of a writer trying to force a narrative to grow from a world that was never designed to support it. Until the core philosophy is addressed, until the writer is willing to abandon the encyclopedia model, they will continue to build beautiful, elaborate prisons for their stories, mistaking the act of decoration for the work of design. Now, let me be absolutely clear about one thing. This powerful impulse to create a rich, believable world comes from a place of genuine passion. It is the very engine that gives our genre its soul. The desire for depth and history provides the texture and wonder that can make a fantasy world feel more real than reality itself. So any writer's intent behind deep world building is not the problem at all. Such a pursuit is both noble and necessary for the craft. We are drawn to this work because we love the feeling of stepping into a place with a past, a place that existed long before a protagonist arrived, and will continue long after they are gone. The solution then is not to build less necessarily, it is to build with an unwavering and ruthless sense of purpose. For too long we have been taught to build the entire world and then go searching for a story within it. From what I've learned in writing and studying fantasy stories for over 20 years now, the key is to reverse this polarity entirely. The missing ingredient here is a principle that I call the minimum viable world. This philosophy does not advocate for small or simple worlds. Instead, it demands that every single element of world building you create is deployed with lethal precision to serve the story you are telling right now. It asks you to trade the archivist's goal of completeness for the architect's goal of purpose. With it, you stop building an encyclopedia and you start designing an arena. And to see this principle in action, we can look to masters of the craft who intuitively understood that the world must be a tool for the story. As a first example for this, consider the brutal efficiency of Robert E. Howard in his Conan the Barbarian stories. Howard's Hyborian Age feels ancient, vast, and layered with forgotten evils. Yet he never delivers a single history lecture to his reader. All of his world building is revealed exclusively through the lens of Conan's immediate life or death problem. We learn of a city's corrupt political structure only because Conan is actively trying to steal a jewel from its highest tower. We discover the terrifying nature of the snake god Set only because Conan is at that very moment fighting its slithering cultists in a dark temple. For Howard, the world was not a passive backdrop. It was a series of immediate lethal obstacles that are custom built to test the protagonist's strength, his cunning, and his indomitable will to survive. Each piece of lore is like a narrative weapon aimed directly at the hero, serving a specific purpose. Robert E. Howard is not the only one we can bring up here as an example though. There's also Glenn Cook, who perfected the art of immersive character-level world-building in his series The Black Company. In that one, we are dropped into a war-torn world with an epic, almost incomprehensible history spanning centuries. But we never receive a clean, objective account of this history. Instead, we learn of it only through the fragmented, biased, and often incomplete entries in the company's annals, written by its cynical physician historian. The lore is never delivered to us directly. It is overheard in battlefield rumors, recounted in weary campfire stories, and mentioned offhand in mission briefings. Cook's world feels immense precisely because we are denied access to the encyclopedia. Our knowledge is limited to what the characters themselves know, and they only ever learn what is critical for their immediate survival. This approach serves the story by creating a constant state of uncertainty and atmospheric pressure. We feel the weight of history without ever needing to have it fully explained. In both of these examples, the world serves the story, not the other way around. So with the outcome explained, how do you actually apply the principle to your own work? Well, the minimum viable world is not a single action, but more like a philosophy expressed through 3 distinct applications. Each one of these acts as a filter, ensuring that every element you create contributes directly to the narrative structural integrity. And the first application is what I call narrative utility. This principle dictates that every single element of your world, could be a law of magic, a political faction, a particular fauna or flora, all of it must justify its existence by serving an active narrative function. Now that function is often to create direct conflict for your protagonist, but it's not always that. It can also serve other crucial purposes. An element might be designed specifically to establish a pervasive atmosphere of dread. Another piece of lore could exist solely to control the story's pacing, slowing it down or speeding it up. Worldbuilding can also be a powerful tool for revealing a character's deepest values or for reinforcing the story's central theme. The architect's primary question is always, what does this piece of lore do for this scene right now? If a brilliant idea for a forgotten empire or a complex magical lineage serves no active purpose in the story you are telling, it is architectural dead weight. So you must be willing to set it aside, recognizing it as a distraction from the core dramatic engine of your narrative. Now moving on, the second application then is the concept of revealed depth. A world feels vast and ancient not because we are shown everything it contains. It feels vast because the few things we are shown strongly imply a much greater unseen whole. While an archivist attempts to present the entire iceberg, charting its full mass in meticulous detail, the architect shows only the tip, trusting that the audience can imagine the immense mysterious structure hidden beneath the water. And this effect is achieved through deliberate and strategic use of omission. Instead of writing a chapter that explains a kingdom's entire 1,000-year history of religious schism, for example, you simply show a character spitting on the ground at the site of a rival sex temple. That single, small action implies a deep and violent history without a single word of exposition. It actively engages the reader's intellect, inviting them to participate in the act of creation by filling in the void you have left. What this does is that the world is not just built on the page, it is constructed in the reader's own mind, which is a far more powerful and immersive experience. Finally, the third and most elegant application is thematic resonance. This is where world building ascends from mere stage setting to a form of narrative poetry. It involves building a world that acts as a physical and symbolic mirror of your story's core thematic struggle. Imagine, for example, you're writing a story about the conflict between fate and free will. In this case, you could set that story in a world governed by rigid, unbreakable prophecies and an unchangeable social caste system. The external world, in this case, would become a constant physical manifestation of the protagonist's internal battle. Or perhaps your novel explores the fragility of memory and personal identity. This story could take place in a city of crumbling ruins, a place where history is constantly contested, forgotten, and rewritten by those in power. Here the setting is no longer a simple container for the characters, it has become an echo of their deepest internal journey. When your world is thematically resonant, it feels utterly inseparable from the story's soul. And mastering this principle of conflict-first design is the core of what transforms a writer from an archivist into an architect. Which is exactly why within my own writing course, we dedicate an entire phase to building these functional dynamic worlds, moving from abstract ideas to concrete narrative engines that power your story forward. You can find out more via the link in the description below. Now, to make the pivot from theory to practice, I want to propose a brief experiment. Don't see this as a homework assignment, but rather a diagnostic tool designed to retrain your creative instincts. I want you to take a single element of world building and subject it to immediate architectural pressure. The goal is to force that world building element to justify its own existence through conflict. And here's the actual challenge. Invent one single, simple law for your magic system. It could be anything, from magic corrupts the land it touches to a spell can only be cast by sacrificing a memory. Write that rule down, and now underneath it, I want you to list 3 specific negative consequences that this law imposes directly upon your protagonist. These cannot be abstract world-level problems. They must be immediate personal sources of narrative friction that complicate your hero's journey. For instance, if your law is magic draws its power from spoken lies, a consequence might be that your honest protagonist is rendered magically impotent. Another could be that they must become a deceptive person to gain power, creating a profound internal conflict. And a final consequence might be that the world is now run by the most convincing liars, creating a political system your hero cannot navigate with integrity. This simple exercise bypasses the archivist impulse entirely because it forbids you from creating lore that is merely interesting. You are forced to build a system that is inherently dramatic because every element that you bring up is already connected to character, conflict, and theme. That is the entire shift in perspective that is needed here. Ultimately, this soul of fantasy is not found within an encyclopedia of a world. It is discovered in the human drama that the world makes possible. This powerful shift, however, also places immense new pressure on the very heart of that engine, your protagonist. Because a world built to test a character is wasted if that character itself fails to deliver at the most critical moments. So watch this video here next to find out what the third man factor means for fantasy writers, and how you can use that knowledge to strengthen your protagonist.